Lawrence, welcome to the show.
All right. Very happy to be here. Great to meet you.
So, you have a show about wine and you are also a psychologist.
Yeah.
How does these two match together?
Well, yeah, it's good. A good question. I would say the, the origin of it really is that I spent 10 years working as a business psychologist, and what does that mean? It's all about the efficiency and processes of businesses for the benefit of the people that work there. So, kind of fast forward 10 years or so, and now I would say interpreting wine, which is my podcast and company. Its mission is to increase the impact and the profitability of wine region
Mm,
marketing through storytelling and through the people that make wine, and getting those
yeah.
stories out there in an audio podcast format.
And I guess drinking a glass of wine will also help people to lose a little bit of their barriers and inhibitions and speak more openly about, their fears
Well, yeah, I
and might help the session.
mean, that's it. And sometimes after interviews, people they thank me for the therapy session. So
Yeah.
obviously, I'm doing something right in terms of, getting deeper into
Mhm.
the I think beyond the normal stories. The normal questions that everyone asks on a podcast can just be surface level, but I like to because of my background, I ask
Yeah,
a follow up
totally. Yeah.
question. I always go
You wanna
on
you wanna bring your
deeper.
unique side to it, right? Do you drink wine while interviewing?
So sometimes, I mean, we tend to be tasting wine.
Nice.
So we might be talking about a particular wine. Often, if I'm at a producer and they have wine there available, then it makes sense because then
Yeah,
we can tell their
totally.
stories, but then we
Hmm.
can also talk about, oh, this wine is good or this vintage is good, and we can
Hmm.
get into more the specifics of the wine itself.
Right. Give us the pitch of your show in 30 seconds. Tell us the name and what's the podcast about.
Okay, so as I mentioned, it's called Interpreting Wine. I'd say the audience and the pitch is a little bit niche, because, as I mentioned, the mission is to stimulate demand for wine using audio and storytelling. So I tend to focus on regions and producers and tell the interpreting wine six wine stories about those regions to get people interested in learning more and trying the
Interesting.
wines.
Yeah. How did everything started? How did you go from being a psychologist in the business world to start a podcast about wine?
Good question. And again, I'll give you the sort of big view, top down view. I would say the key element was actually I was living in Spain at the time, and I was transitioning. I would say I was transitioning from psychology, and I wanted to do my own business at some point. But I was at that moment I was exploring possibilities in Spain to work. So I actually started the podcast in order to try to get a job in marketing, which of course lots of psychology is used in marketing.
Right.
But at that time, very few people had podcasts, so I wanted to be a trailblazer. So it started out really small, I would say, not with a grand plan, and then over time it just built and built and built, and probably over time I brought in more and more of the psychology, and then I think it became something that was quite different from what was in the marketplace, and then it meant that it then owned, I think, its own niche in the podcast marketplace.
I love it. I love how podcasting just gets into our lives without us actually wanting for, and suddenly it's not like our main. So at the moment, how many views do you have, or how many downloads do you have per episode?
So it and as well, it's probably the impossible question to answer, because good thing about podcasts is it's always going up.
Distributing, yeah,
But in
yeah.
the first 3 months, it tends to be around the sort of 2,000 mark.
Wow.
And as I mentioned earlier, the audience is kind of quite niche. It tends to be people who are working in the wine trade, usually in the US, UK, and Scandinavia. And
Hmm.
these might be people who are buying wine. These might be sommeliers. These might be people who are
Right.
studying about wine. So this is a resource and a tool really for them to access that
Hmm.
information without needing to travel, and it can fit in
Yeah.
conveniently
Hmm.
alongside their day to day.
I mean, 2,000 downloads per episode is quite a good mark. Most people won't have more than 100, 200. So getting to those numbers is a great achievement. What are the best, if you could pick three techniques, three marketing techniques to grow the show, which ones work best for your podcast?
Well, I'll start maybe with the most unique and maybe the most challenging, which was actually in my first year, which was 2018. I
Hmm.
actually I produced 220 episodes.
Okay.
So I found a way to basically just really pump out a lot of content, and I think that, in combined with the fact that it was still quite a niche um, area, wine podcasting is quite niche. I think that those two together, lots of content in a small niche, I think it kind of blew the doors off, and very quickly I got known about. Well, more the podcast and the name of the podcast, which is
Right.
again is the more important thing. It's not the person, it's the podcast. Um,
Hmm.
the podcast got covered in the newspapers. I started
Ah.
getting contacted by wine regions to do coverage. So I think it's almost those two tips together. If you can really, get a lot of content out there at the start,
Hmm.
and then also obviously think about your niche, think about who's listening. I don't think you have to be super clear on who's going to listen straight off, but I think that having something like a social media channel where you can communicate with guests, that means you can start asking questions and you can discover who's listening
Hmm.
and start to ask them, what do you want to hear, and then start making content for them. So I think it's those three things: having a niche, getting lots of content out there, and then using social media channel
Hmm.
to make it a
Yeah.
two-way conversation with the audience.
What social media channels work best for your niche?
So in my case, it was definitely Instagram. I would say that, especially in that moment, I was really loving Instagram. I was on there all the time. It was just a,
Hmm.
a lot of a lot of engagement. And based on that last point, every single episode, I used to give my Instagram handle in the outro. I'd always say, come over, follow me on social media."
Ah,
And then in the Instagram, I used to promote the podcast. So there was a,
right.
there was a two-way
Pointing
promotion
to each
going on.
other.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And I think, again, we're only talking 2018, but I do believe that actually you could get a lot more organic reach on Instagram at that time than you do
Hmm.
now. So it was probably easier to use Instagram to
Yeah.
to to
Yeah.
grow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And 2018 was also kind of the boom of podcasting when it first started once again. So it started, I guess, in early 2000s, but then in 2018, so many people started podcasting. So
Yeah.
that plus, being a niche
Yeah.
probably worked out really well for you.
Yeah,
I'm
I
curious.
would, yeah, I would agree. I
Hmm.
think that certainly the time was a good time to to join. I think also, though, just the consistency has been really
Yeah.
important.
Hmm.
And I think also the fact that wine does actually have a big problem at the moment. It's actually, I don't know if it's the same in Portugal, but certainly in the
Hmm.
UK and the US, the consumption of wine is decreasing. And I
Oh,
would
I
say
didn't
maybe
know that.
slightly fast forward the timeline. Really, in 2020, it was when I then really started getting people who are in wine regions interested in using the channel to reach people, because I think
Yeah.
there was a delay between, as you say, everyone finding podcasts 2018, but then I think for me it was only then in 2020, when we had the pandemic, that people in the wine regions, the one who were my clients, they really then realized, wow, interpreting wine, this could be a really good channel to reach the people that we need to reach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm also interested in learning more about the monetization. But before that, I would love to ask you, how did like AI, because AI and these AI tools like PodSqueeze started around, I guess, 2021,
Mm,
2020,
mhm.
and you started a podcast in 2018. Are you using these tools? And if so, how are they changing your flow?
Good question. So yeah, as you say, obviously I didn't have AI when I was starting. So this is a new service. But I think it does. Your question does link really well to something that I said earlier, because even now, so I had most of my Instagram growth. Still Instagram
Mm-hmm.
is an important channel. I had most of my Instagram growth was probably before 2021, and again, it's just more and more difficult to break through break through into people's feeds. So
Right.
I think, again, getting more content out there on a consistent basis is really important. So I think tools like PodSqueeze are really important from that repurposing point of view. So I'll always be open to exploring ways to create smaller sized content based on a longer interview. You know, I
Right.
think that's really the big use that I can see, and I think that your interface, where you have something like show notes coming out, highlights coming out, transcripts coming out. All of these they're all potential either content pieces in their own right, but also it can just help if you're then, for example, sometimes I might write a blog, having that as the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when I started, I didn't have anything, but even just having, okay, here's the timelines, here's the transcript, these are maybe some
Right.
talking points. That's all really helpful.
It gives you a good way to start the ideation phase so that you can then write good blog posts. And what kind of content do you share on Instagram?
I mean, a lot. It's a bit of a mixture, really. So I maybe, if I'm in a wine region, I like sharing videos and pictures of the wine region. I think that's still
Mm-hmm.
great content, and that's still stuff that my listeners and my followers, they do
Mm-hmm.
like to see. But I also, I think, because I am working in interpreting wine, and it is my main focus. I do also do some um, business development on there. So I will tend to keep it quite light-hearted, but I produce a lot of memes that are around the wine industry, and maybe pointing out in a fun way some of the opportunities that people might be missing out on, and even sometimes I point out the mistakes that I think wine regions are making. But again, it's Instagram. I don't want it to be too
Instagram, yeah.
heavy, so I use a meme.
What is the biggest mistakes that wine regions and producers make?
Okay, so I've got three. So the three mistakes they make are: one, the language that they use when they're
Mm-hmm.
talking about their wines is too technical, and it focuses on facts and not stories. Number two is that they
Interesting.
use channels where the most engaged audiences are. So they'll, use something like an Instagram, which has really low engagement and is, small content. And then
Mm-hmm.
three, they'll I believe, waste a lot of money on in-person events that are really expensive, and they don't get the engagement that
Mm.
even a single episode of my podcast, it gets a significant amount of engagement, and
Right.
I don't think that um, the regions, they use that, they use expensive events, and I think they're wasting a lot of time, a lot of money on that.
How many people do they host in these events?
So this is the thing. I mean, so what happens? So for example, in a place like London, they will try to reach professionals.
Mm.
It is logical to try to reach professionals. Why? Because imagine if you have one sommelier or one barman talking about your wine, they might talk to 300 people in 1 week. So it's really efficient. Get that one person there. It's like influence the influencer. The big problem is, though, is that they hold these events and maybe only 200 people turn up, and maybe
Hmm.
they've had 500 people say they're going to come,
Right.
and only 200 people turn up,
And
and
they are expensive too.
they're really,
They're
they've got
expensive to
to, you
organize.
imagine, they've
Mm.
got to they've got to hire the venue, they've got to have the producers there. So if it's, say
Yeah.
Portugal or Spain or wherever it is, they have to fly in, they have to
Right.
go to hotels. They've got to eat, of course, while they're here.
Mm.
And as well, while the producers are in the event, then they can't be doing their work. So they
Mm.
either the work's not getting done, or they're paying somebody to do their work. So
Yeah.
it all takes so much time and concentration. And I
Makes
go
sense.
to
Yeah.
these events, so I'm not saying, and I enjoy them, and so there's, it's not exactly a conflict. I think it's just, I think they should be thinking about how to make them more effective and get more from
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the key
Yeah.
message.
I'm as a last topic of this interview, and I think a lot of the listeners are also interested in on how you're monetizing the podcast, right?
Yeah,
And I guess you have
exactly,
audience for that.
exactly. Yeah,
So yeah, tell me about the process. How do you get clients, and what kind of ads do you? I guess you monetize with ads, I would assume. Uh, yeah, how does that process
yeah.
work?
No, I'm really happy you asked that, because I think I think this is a way that I've not seen a lot of people trying to monetize. So I don't monetize with ads.
Oh,
My
interesting.
big thing is exactly continuing from what we just spoke about. Is I've discovered a big problem for the wine industry, which is how do they reach and influence the people they're trying to influence more effectively. So that's the big problem that I'm focusing
Mm.
on. I see the real, like the real kind of the pain point,
Right.
the pimple, or the
Yeah.
the thing that I'm kind of scratching at. I is events. Why? Because they are the most expensive. So rather than going down an ad-based route, which is just purely based on the number of listeners, I'm still not a massive, compared to many other podcasts, it's still very small. But I still see that there's a huge amount of value in reaching those people, those 2,000 or so professionals in the US, in the UK, in Scandinavia. So I have then made a proposal to the wine regions about what they can get by working together, which is often, worth really tens of thousands of dollars in
Mm.
terms of professional engagement. And so that is the argument that I have to make, and that is the proposal that I have to make to those wine
Mm.
regions that says, working with me is going to give you a really amazing return on investment. Why? Because you've
Right.
already got this problem, and you're solving it in the way you're solving it, which is a very expensive way. And I can give you more
Mm.
exposure using the podcast channel, which you
So
probably
so
don't have.
you the services you sell to them are more like you selling your own services as a kind of business consultant to them.
Exactly, exactly. So I
Okay.
put together a whole process. So effectively, it's a three-stage process. So around, and we talk about those events. So I would work with them, and I would say, okay, before your event, we should do a long format podcast interview together, and there's a whole
Ah,
set of
interesting.
preparation and questionnaires that I do. So I never just sort of go into an interview. It's a
So
really
for them to get, you sell this package, and included in this package is the interview in your show.
exactly. But
Ah,
arguably the even more valuable than that is that there's a whole process before the interview. So I mentioned earlier the 6 wine stories model I use. I effectively I help them get their communication really clear, so that they do really well on the interview. But that's got massive
okay,
value in all the other content
right.
that they're going to produce as well. So
Very
that's
interesting.
step one.
Yeah.
And then step two, I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on the screen, but remember I mentioned the 6 wine stories. But based on
Right.
that, I give them one of these, which is a producer PDF, and this means that before the event, they can be sending out already information about each producer. They don't just say, "Oh, turn up on the day and we'll tell you more." They can actually
Right.
start, and this uses audio. This uses audio from the show, or audio recorded separately to tell the story about the wine.
Ah.
And
So they
then
can kind of scan that and hear that segment of the interview.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So
Wow.
it's they can scan that, they can get the stories, get the wine, and then the third stage is just recording content at the fair itself. So if there's a masterclass or a talk, record the live, so it's
Right.
live recording, and then release that afterwards.
Wow, Lawrence, it's really interesting. You just took your podcast to the next level. You know, it's the whole package, a whole service with printed kind of menus with audio included in it, and interviews, and wow, that's very interesting.
Thank
Yeah.
you, thank you.
I think we learned a lot with you today, and yeah, tell us again the name of your podcast. Where can people find you? Your Instagram, your socials. Tell us everything so that people can stop listening to this and go and listen to your podcast.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I would just say, interpreting wine is the podcast. Interpretingwine.com gets into all of what we've spoken about there. So, I would even just say interpretingwine.com. And
Perfect.
of course, I'd love to have any of your listeners following me and connecting on social media. I'll just keep it to one and easy.
Mm,
Instagram is at interpreting wine. So that's cool.
perfect.
Reach
I
out.
will also link everything in the description of this episode. Lawrence, thank you so much to for sharing your lessons with us.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.